For 3 weeks straight, my sister-in-law arrived at my front door at exactly 10 a.m. There was no warm-up to this new routine, no gentle transition from our usual distant relationship to this sudden, intense devotion. She simply appeared on the porch one Tuesday morning with a thermal bag and a look of practiced sorrow. My husband was fading, his once strong body becoming a shadow of the man I married, and she claimed she was there to help me carry the weight. She didn't offer to do the dishes or run the vacuum. She went straight to his bedside. It dropped me into a pattern of secrecy that I didn't know how to navigate. Every morning, the click of her heels on the hardwood floor acted as a countdown. She would give me a tight, pitying smile and usher me toward my home office, insisting that I focus on my work so we wouldn't lose our health insurance. I felt a strange, quiet unease every time the bedroom door closed behind her. Why hadn't she ever shown this much interest in him before? That single line of thought planted a question in my mind that wouldn't stop growing. Why was she so insistent on being alone with him? It was a quiet alarm bell, impossible to ignore. My name is Myra Boston, and I am 34 years old. Before my life turned into a slow-motion wreck, I spent my days as a structural architect. I built bridges, calculated load tolerances, and ensured that massive steel structures could withstand the invisible pressures of wind and gravity. I was a person who lived by logic and professional precision. I believed that if you followed the blueprints and checked the measurements, things wouldn't fall apart. I applied that same mindset to my marriage and my home, believing that our foundation was solid enough to survive anything life threw at us. Kyle was my rock, a man who had survived mountain climbs and intense corporate takeovers with a grin. Seeing him buckled and broken by a mystery illness was a structural failure I hadn't prepared for. As a woman who prided herself on being observant, I felt a deep sense of shame that I couldn't fix him. When a person like me, someone trained to see the smallest cracks in a foundation, misses something vital, the eventual collapse feels even more shocking. I was so busy trying to keep the roof over our heads that I didn't notice someone was unscrewing the bolts from the floorboards beneath my very feet. I was about to learn that trust is not the same as inattention. Kyle's decline started with small, explainable things. It was a bit of dizziness in the morning, a slight tremor in his hand when he reached for his coffee mug, or a sudden bout of brain fog that made him forget where he left his keys. We thought it was stress at first, perhaps the lingering effects of a flu. But then the weight loss began. His face grew gaunt, and his eyes, once bright and full of life, became clouded with a constant, dull pain. The doctors ran tests, but the results were always frustratingly vague, pointing toward an atypical neurological decline that they couldn't quite name. This tapped into a universal fear that kept me awake at night. What if something is terribly wrong and no one notices until it is too late? It wasn't a dramatic sudden illness that demanded immediate surgery. It was a creeping, deniable sickness that stole him away inch by inch. Because the symptoms were gradual, I allowed myself to be lulled into a state of exhausted acceptance. I was stuck in a mercy trap, feeling grateful for any help I could get, even if it came from someone I had never truly liked. I was so desperate for a miracle that I ignored the fact that the help was arriving in a thermal bag every single morning. Lydia, Kyle's sister, had always been a complicated figure in our lives. She wasn't introduced to our marriage as an evil person. She was simply charming, unreliable, and slightly opportunistic. She had a way of making her problems feel like everyone else's responsibility. In the past, she would drop by only when she needed a loan or a favor. But now, she was the picture of a grieving, devoted sister. The danger she posed was plausible, not exaggerated, which is what made it so hard to call out. She looked like a woman trying her best, but there were signs. She would make jokes that weren't really jokes about our cottage in the woods. "It's so much work to maintain, Myra," she would say while stroking Kyle's hand. "Maybe it's time to let it go so you can focus on the medical bills." These were narrative seeds, planted quietly in the middle of our grief, designed to bloom into suggestions later on. She was a master of the authority anchor, positioning herself as the one who truly understood Kyle's needs because they shared the same blood. I felt like an outsider in my own home, a cold, wife who was too focused on blueprints and insurance to provide the soul-healing tinctures Lydia brought daily. That was the kind of husband I was, Kyle once whispered to me during a rare moment of clarity, apologizing for being a burden. That line hit me like a quiet confession, and it made me wonder if I was missing signs in my own life. I began to feel a deep layer of guilt. Was I ignoring the most important things because I was too busy? I was a woman who calculated load tolerances for a living, yet I was failing to see the stress fractures in my own family. This feeling of self-reflection is what keeps you hooked. It makes the story stop being just mine and starts being yours. I spent my nights researching his symptoms, but my brain was fried from 10-hour workdays. Lydia would emerge from the bedroom at 2 p.m., wiping her eyes and telling me that Kyle had finally found some peace and was sleeping deeply. I felt a secret resentment toward her for being the one who got to see his quiet moments, but I buried it under a mountain of gratitude. I thought I was being a good wife by working to pay for the specialists, but I was actually creating a vacuum that Lydia was more than happy to fill. I didn't realize that suspicion rarely arrives with fireworks. It creeps in like a cold draft under a locked door. The first real crack in my resolve appeared when I saw Lydia's truck in the driveway. Nothing specific happened, but everything felt wrong. She had mentioned being completely broke just a week prior, crying about how she might lose her apartment because she was spending so much time helping us. Yet, when I looked out the window, I noticed she was wearing a brand new, designer wool coat that must have cost at least $2,000. It was a small detail, a tiny measurement that didn't align with the rest of the structure, but as an architect, I knew that even a millimeter of misalignment could bring down a tower. I began to notice a pattern in the house that I hadn't seen before. The tremors in Kyle's hands were always worse in the evenings, right after Lydia left. When I tried to talk to him about his day, he seemed heavily sedated, his speech slurred far beyond what his condition usually caused. Whenever I entered the room while she was there, she would immediately stop talking and start adjusting his blankets. There was a tension in the air, a pattern recognition that my brain was finally starting to process. Suspicion was no longer a draft, it was a gale-force wind shaking the windows of my mind. I decided to install a camera. It wasn't an easy decision. It felt like a betrayal of the trust that is supposed to exist within a family. But that was the point. Something was off enough that I had to investigate. I bought a small, discreet nanny cam hidden inside a digital clock and placed it on the bookshelf facing Kyle's bed. I told myself it was for his safety, a way to make sure he didn't fall while I was in the office, but deep down, I knew I was looking for Lydia. Installing that camera was the turning point. It created a physical manifestation of my doubt. Every time I looked at that clock, I felt a surge of anticipation and dread. I knew that eventually the footage would reveal something. This is the essence of delayed payoff storytelling. You don't get the answer right away. You have to sit with the discomfort of knowing that a secret is being recorded, waiting for the moment you are brave enough to watch it. I went through the next few days in a daze, checking the live feed during my lunch breaks, but seeing nothing but the mundane movements of a sick room. The tension was building, waiting for the false calm to break. The first week of footage was almost disappointingly harmless. I spent hours at night, long after Lydia had gone home and Kyle was asleep, scrubbing through videos of her sitting by his side. She read him stories, adjusted his pillows, and sometimes just sat in silence, looking out the window. It was innocent, even comforting. I started to feel a deep sense of shame for doubting her. I thought about uninstalling the camera and apologizing to her for my silent accusations. This was the false calm before the storm, the moment where the audience is lulled into thinking they were wrong. Then the shock hit harder because of that brief period of trust. On the Tuesday of the second week, I noticed something different. Lydia didn't start reading right away. She waited until she thought I was firmly entrenched in a conference call. I saw her stand up and walk to the door, listening intently to the sounds of my office in the next room. When she was satisfied that I was occupied, her entire demeanor changed. The grieving sister mask dropped, replaced by a cold, calculated efficiency, that made my blood run cold. She wasn't there to comfort him. She was there to work. The reveal scene happened at exactly 1:42 p.m. on a Wednesday. The camera caught Lydia reaching into her large designer bag and pulling out a small amber-colored vial. She didn't look sad. She looked bored. She moved toward the nightstand where Kyle's daily supplement bottles sat. With a steady hand, she opened his brain health capsules and began pouring a fine, white powder into the bottles, shaking them gently to mix the contents. It was a visual, silent, and undeniable act of betrayal. There was no dramatic music, no yelling, just a quiet, horrifying action that changed everything. She then went to his hydration IV bag. She pulled a syringe from her bra, injected a clear liquid into the port, and watched the line for a moment as the medicine moved toward my husband's vein. This was the explosion I had been dreading. The restraint in her movements made it so much more chilling. She wasn't a mustache-twirling villain. She was a woman performing a chore. She was systematically poisoning the man I loved in the very house I had built for our protection. I watched the screen of my laptop in my office, my hand over my mouth, unable to breathe as I realized my sister-in-law was a cold-blooded assassin. I didn't run into the room and scream. I didn't call the police immediately. Instead, I sat in my car in a CVS parking lot for 11 minutes, staring at the steering wheel. This was my human reaction. Not heroic, but real. I felt a wave of shock so intense that it felt like physical paralysis. My logical architect's brain was trying to find an explanation, a load tolerance for this level of evil, but there was none. I felt a crushing sense of denial. Maybe it was just vitamins. Maybe the doctor had told her to do it. But the secrecy told a different story. I was terrified. If I confronted her now, she would find a way to spin it. She would say she was helping him pass peacefully or that I was hallucinating. I needed more than just a blurry video of powder. I needed proof of her motive. I sat in that parking lot, feeling the weight of my own inattention pressing down on me. I had let this woman into my sanctuary. I had let her touch his food and his medicine. The guilt was a physical weight, a structural failure of my own heart. Audiences trust what feels real, and there is nothing more real than the frozen, stuttering panic of a woman who realizes her life is a lie. Once the shock wore off, the stakes shifted from suspicion to survival. I couldn't let her give him another dose, but I also couldn't let her know I knew. I had to become as great an actor as she was. I went back into the house that evening and thanked her for her help, my voice trembling only slightly. As soon as she left, I took the supplement bottles and a sample of the IV fluid. I drove to a private lab across town, paying a premium for an emergency toxicology report. The results were a death sentence, high-dose liquid sedatives and industrial-strength blood thinners. The poisoning was causing the neurological damage, the slurred speech, and the atypical decline. It wasn't an illness, it was a chemical takedown. Every day she visited, she was pushing him closer to a stroke or a fatal fall. The stakes were now life versus time. If I didn't act perfectly, Kyle would die. I began to replace the poison supplements with identical, clean ones, and I tampered with the IV bags so the medication would never reach his bloodstream. I was fighting a silent war in a sick room, watching my husband's eyes slowly begin to clear as the toxins left his system. I needed to know why. Why would a sister kill her only brother? I began to dig into our finances, and that's when I found the motive. It was a classic, ugly combination of greed and betrayal. I discovered that Lydia had incurred a massive gambling debt to some very dangerous people. But the real kicker was the document I saw her make Kyle sign on the camera. It wasn't a card or a sweet note. Through a high-resolution zoom of the footage, I realized she had tricked him into signing a power of attorney and a revised will while he was heavily sedated. She was positioning herself to inherit everything: our savings, Kyle's life insurance, and our cottage. She had even started draining our joint medical fund, a fact I had missed because I was too exhausted to check the statements. This hit a universal nerve. Family betrayal for money. It is one of the most emotionally charged themes because it ruins the one thing we are supposed to be able to count on. Lydia didn't care about Kyle's life. She saw him as a bank account with a heartbeat, one she was eager to close. The real villain in this story wasn't just Lydia. It was my own delayed attention. This was the emotional core of my regret. I looked back at all the times I had ignored my instincts because I was too busy or too tired. I had missed the signs because I wanted to believe in the goodness of family. This created a deep emotional echo that I know many people feel. What if I wait too long to notice the cracks? I realized that trust is a luxury you earn, not a default setting you leave on while the house burns down. I sat by Kyle's bed while he slept, crying not just for his pain, but for my own blindness. I had been an architect who ignored the foundation of her own life. I promised him, silently, that I would dismantle Lydia's life with the same precision she had used on his. I wouldn't just call the police, I would ensure she lost everything. I began to document every cent she stole and every vial she used. I was no longer a victim. I was a builder planning a demolition. The story was no longer about a dying husband. It was about a wife who was finally waking up. The resolution couldn't be a fairy tale ending where everyone forgives and forgets. Reality is more believable and shareable when it's messy. Kyle survived, but the damage to his nervous system would take months, maybe years, of physical therapy to repair. Justice had to happen, but it wouldn't be satisfying if it was just a quick arrest. I wanted Lydia to feel the walls closing in, just as Kyle had felt his own mind closing in under her care. I began to set the stage for the final act, ensuring there were no loopholes for her to crawl through. I stayed quiet for one more week, watching her through the camera, documenting her growing frustration as Kyle didn't fade as quickly as she expected. I saw her increase the dosage in the bottles I had already swapped for harmless flour and sugar. She was getting desperate, her movements becoming erratic. She was a predator who realized her prey wasn't dying on schedule. I felt a cold, hard satisfaction watching her unravel. I was the one in control now, and I was about to show her what happens when an architect decides to take down a structure. Trust is not the same as inattention. That was the final lesson I learned. This story transformed from a personal tragedy into a warning for everyone else. People share stories that make them feel like others need to hear the message. I wanted my experience to be the payload that saved someone else from a Lydia. As I prepared to reveal the truth to the world, I realized that the viral nature of this story wouldn't be the crime itself, but the way a normal, logical person handled the ultimate betrayal. The final days of the 3-week period arrived. Lydia was planned to come over for a final talk about hospice. She thought she was coming to deliver the killing blow to our finances. Little did she know, I had invited a few other guests to witness the truth. I had the lab reports, the bank statements, and 21 days of high-definition footage. The stage was set, the blueprints were finalized, and the demolition was scheduled for 10 a.m. I was Myra Boston, and I was about to protect my bridge, no matter what it cost. The day of the hospice meeting arrived. Lydia walked in with her usual theatrical sigh, her designer coat swinging. She didn't know that I had already spent the morning with the police and our family attorney. I had them tucked away in the guest room, watching the live feed from the camera. I sat Lydia down in the living room, the very room where she had sat and plotted our ruin. I acted the part of the grieving, overwhelmed wife one last time. "I don't know if I can do this anymore, Lydia," I whispered, watching her eyes light up with predatory greed. She leaned in, her voice dripping with fake honey. "It's okay, Myra. You've done enough. If you just sign these final management papers, I can take over everything. You can go stay at the cottage and rest." She actually had the audacity to suggest I move into the very property she was trying to steal. She pushed a folder toward me, her hand shaking slightly with excitement. This was it, the moment she thought she had won. I looked at the folder, then looked directly into the camera lens hidden in the clock. "I think we should look at some other documents first," I said. I stood up and turned on the television. Lydia's face went from smug to confused and then to a ghostly, pale white as the footage of her pouring powder into Kyle's supplements began to play. The silence in the room was deafening. There were no excuses she could make. The camera had captured her face, the vial, and the calculated way she had looked at the door to make sure I wasn't coming. She tried to stand up, to grab the remote, but I pushed her back down into the chair with a strength I didn't know I had. "Sit down, Lydia. We're just getting to the best part." The door to the guest room opened, and the police stepped out, followed by our brother-in-law and Kyle's parents. The look of absolute horror on their faces was the emotional payoff I had been waiting for. Lydia began to wail, a high-pitched, screeching sound that had no soul in it. She tried to claim she was easing his pain, but I pulled out the lab reports showing the blood thinners and sedatives. "This isn't mercy, Lydia. This is murder for a gambling debt." The handcuffs clicked shut, a sound that felt like the final bolt being tightened on a new, stronger foundation. But the story didn't end with her arrest. As Lydia was being led away, she turned to me with a venomous sneer. "You think you've won, Myra? Check the accounts again. You were already bankrupt." This was twist number 1. I ran to my office and pulled up our primary savings. It was empty. She hadn't just been draining the medical fund. She had used the power of attorney to transfer our entire life savings into an offshore account that morning, right before she arrived. My heart sank. Even with her in jail, we were penniless, and Kyle's treatment was costing thousands a week. I felt the ground falling out from under me again. How could I have missed a transfer of that size? I realized she must have had an accomplice inside the bank, or someone who helped her bypass the security alerts. I sat at my desk, the victory feeling hollow. Kyle was safe, but we were going to lose the house and the cottage anyway. Then twist number 2 hit. I received an email notification from a private investigator I had hired to look into Lydia's past. It wasn't just a gambling debt. Lydia was working with a medical consultant who specialized in making wealthy relatives disappear. The investigator's report included a photo of Lydia meeting a man in a lab coat at a local diner. My blood turned to ice when I recognized him. It was Dr. Eris, Kyle's primary neurologist, the man who had given us the atypical decline diagnosis. This was twist number 3. The entire medical journey had been a setup. Dr. Eris had been receiving kickbacks from Lydia to validate her claims of Kyle's deteriorating mind, ensuring that no one would question the heavy sedation or the signed documents. It was a professional, high-stakes assassination plot involving the very person sworn to save him. I realized I couldn't just call the regular police for this. I needed the fraud unit and the medical board. I felt a surge of cold, architect's rage. They had turned my husband's body into a construction site for their own greed. I called the detective who had just taken Lydia away and told him about Dr. Eris. "He's in on it," I said, my voice steady. "Check his private records. You'll find the payments from Lydia." I was dismantling the entire structure now, brick by corrupt brick. They thought they were smarter than a woman who built bridges, but they forgot that I knew how to find the weakest point. Twist number 4 arrived when the police raided Dr. Eris' office. They found more than just kickback records. They found a death file for 3 other patients who had died under his care in the last 2 years. Lydia had been the devoted caregiver for 2 of them. This wasn't her first time. She was a serial predator who used family ties to bypass suspicion. The authority anchor she used, the idea that family knows best, was her primary weapon. As the news broke, I felt a strange sense of relief. It wasn't just my inattention. I was up against a professional team of monsters. But the most shocking twist, number 5, came from Kyle himself. As the toxins fully cleared his system, he regained his speech. He called me to his bedside, his voice weak but clear. "Myra," he whispered, "the cottage, check the floorboards in the tool shed." I didn't understand. I drove to the cottage that night, my flashlight cutting through the dark. I pried up the boards Kyle had mentioned and found a fireproof safe. Inside was a handwritten note and a flash drive. Kyle had suspected Lydia months ago, before the brain fog became too thick, and he had been documenting his own decline. The flash drive contained audio recordings Kyle had made on his phone during his rest periods with Lydia. I listened to her voice, cold and mocking, telling him he was going to die and there was nothing he could do about it. But the real treasure was the insurance policy he had taken out in secret. A policy that specifically protected against criminal interference and fraud. He had set a trap for her, knowing he might not be strong enough to spring it himself. He had trusted me to find it. This was the most significant emotional payoff. Kyle had been fighting for us the whole time. The note in the safe said, "Myra, if you're reading this, I'm either gone or you've saved me. Either way, use this to bury her. I cried in that dusty tool shed, feeling the immense love and foresight of the man I had almost lost. He hadn't just been a victim. He had been a silent partner in his own rescue. With this evidence, the offshore accounts were flagged as criminal proceeds. Because the transfers were made under duress and recorded by Kyle, the bank was legally required to reverse them. The money was coming back. Lydia's final move had been neutralized by a man she thought was a vegetable. The downfall of Lydia and Dr. Eris was swift and public. The story of the architect and the assassin's sister hit the local news and then went viral nationwide. People were horrified by the mercy trap and the medical betrayal. Lydia was sentenced to life without parole, her designer coats replaced by a rough orange jumpsuit. Dr. Eris lost his license and was sent to federal prison for medical fraud and manslaughter in the other cases. The structure they had built out of lies and poison had collapsed on top of them, leaving nothing but rubble. But for me, the true rise was seeing Kyle walk again. It started with a single step in the physical therapy room, his hand gripping mine. He wasn't the same man. He was thinner, and he moved with a slight limp. But his eyes were clear and full of the fire I loved. We stood on the porch of our cottage, looking out at the woods. The foundation of our life had been shaken, but it hadn't broken. We had reinforced it with truth, vigilance, and a love that had survived a calculated attempt at murder. I realized that my life as an architect had prepared me for this, but not in the way I expected. It wasn't about the steel or the concrete, it was about the integrity of the design. A marriage, a family, a life, they all require constant inspection. You can't just build it and walk away. You have to check the bolts. You have to listen for the creaks. And you have to be brave enough to look at the camera when you suspect something is wrong. I had saved my husband, and in doing so, I had saved myself from a life of blind trust. 6 months later, we held a small party at the cottage. No tinctures, no home-cooked soup from Lydia, just real food and real friends. I looked around at the people who had stood by us, and I felt a deep sense of peace. The viral story of our survival had become a beacon for others, a reminder that trust is not the same as inattention. I had written the final chapter of our nightmare, and the ending was more satisfying than any blueprint I had ever drawn. We were the masters of our own structure now. Kyle walked over to me, refusing his cane for the first time. He took my hand and led me to the edge of the deck. "We're okay, Myra," he said, his voice firm. "We're more than okay." I leaned my head on his shoulder, feeling the solid, rhythmic beat of his heart, a heart that Lydia had tried to stop and failed. I thought about the 3 weeks of heels on the porch and the amber vials, and I realized they were just a test of our structural integrity. We had passed. The world might remember us as a viral story, a cautionary tale for the digital age. But to us, we were just two people who refused to let a crack in the foundation bring down the whole house. I looked at the digital clock on the mantel, the one that had held the camera, and I decided to keep it there. Not as a tool for spying, but as a monument to the moment I chose to see the truth. Every time I look at the time, I am reminded that every second is a chance to be attentive to the ones you love. My name is Myra Boston, and I am 34 years old. I am an architect, a wife, and a survivor. I have learned that the most dangerous people don't come at you with knives in the dark. They come at you with soup and a smile at 10 a.m. They use your love and your exhaustion as a shield. But they always leave a trace. They always make a mistake. And if you are brave enough to watch the footage, you will find the strength to tear their world down and build something beautiful in its place. Kyle and I are building a new house now. One with big windows and an open floor plan, no dark corners, no hidden rooms. We live our lives with a quiet alarm bell, always tuned to the truth. Our story didn't end in a hospital bed or a courtroom. It continues every day in the simple, honest moments of a life reclaimed. Trust is a beautiful thing, but a foundation is built on what you can prove. And I have proven that as long as I am standing, this bridge will never fall. We are finally home, and the truth has set us free. If this story had your heart racing, you aren't alone. It's a chilling reminder that sometimes the people we trust the most are the ones we should be watching the closest. What would you have done in Myra's shoes? Would you have waited for the lab results, or would you have confronted Lydia the second you saw that camera footage? Let us know in the comments below. We read every single one. If you love high-stakes, realistic revenge stories and deep dives into the dark side of human nature, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell. We post gripping, emotionally charged stories like this every day that you won't find anywhere else. Don't miss the next reveal. Join the community today.